for our last panel session before our breakout session. Is going to be on finance. And I'd like to introduce, to make sure I get the title right, Bill Sissons, the Executive Director of North America for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So warm welcome for Bill, please.
Thanks, Martin. Let me just get the panelists up to the stage. Reed, Vic, Mark. Is Michelle in the room? There she is. Hi, Michelle. I haven't met you yet. We'll get to know each other pretty well, I think. Let's do a little tension breaker, though. Get your brains working. A little audience participation. How many Chiefs fans in the room? There's 3 Chiefs fans in the room. So how many 49er fans in the room? All right, a little bit more of the underdog play here, so that's good. You know how much capital was on display last night? I don't have the number, but I know it was $7 million for a 30-second ad. Think about that. And we have 50-year-old chillers in equipment rooms, right? So, I mean, just the importance of the finance discussion that we're about to enter into is huge relative to the agenda we have, decarbonizing the built environment. And anybody join the COP28 activities in Dubai last year? Handful. There were kind of 2 or 3 big takeaways that I came out of from there. One, it was called the Global Stocktake, and the Global Stocktake was really that moment where all the countries that were represented at COP were essentially reporting out their progress. We're behind. We're way behind. Okay, so that's big takeaway number 1. Big takeaway number 2, we have to triple the investments in renewable energy and double the investments in energy efficiency if we're going to get anywhere close to getting this right. And third, finance. Climate finance. It's called the great enabler of climate action. It's woefully behind. So this conversation is really about all the great things we heard about the energy solutions that we just learned about. Renewables have taken off. Fuel cells are finding their future. Energy efficiency is investable. And infrastructure where we can think of power plants in a different way. They're all there for the taking. The data is proving itself to be useful in terms of the investment models. These things are no-brainers, right? But why is capital stuck? Why is the finance problem such a big problem? So let's get right into it. Reed, IonicBlue. Tell us a little bit about it.
Sure.
And then maybe share with this group some of the options that people can start to look into when it comes to financing these solutions. Over to you.
Thanks. So IonicBlue is a joint venture between Apollo and Johnson Controls. And we bring to market basically the financing for the infrastructure as a service or energy as a service. So again, flexible, agnostic. We bring different structures that are, I would say, bespoke in the industry, but yet they exist today. So we bring them all together. We really do try to achieve the financial goals and the outcomes the customer wants in conjunction with our partner, Johnson Controls. So that's a bit of the background there. We'll be talking more about the private industry today than the public sector, federal sector in terms of funding. So just get kind of baseline there. But ultimately, right, the options are, of course, the customer can fund it itself, right, via debt, equity options. But as we all know too, right, the cost of capital, the prioritization, right, become a big issue recently. And potentially you're going to see some credit crunch here with companies in 2024 because of the interest rates that rose last year, which will affect them this year. So those options are still there for companies, of course, to fund themselves, right, in different vacuums. But there are limited structures when you do that, right? Of course, you can go raise debt, you can use your balance sheet, you can try to raise equity, but usually those terms are pretty fixed, and I would say it doesn't help the ROI discussion that we've been talking about and the payback for some of the systems and technologies that we've also spoke about. So the alternative solutions, right, or the as a service kind of model, is I'll lay it out there. Again, those terms and the solutions and technologies that goes into that can be any of what we described, right? It can be simple paybacks, 1 to 5 years. It could be longer paybacks for more infrastructure type assets that are necessary to drive efficiencies. But ultimately, we create these structures for whatever the financial goals of the customers are, right? So they can own the asset, we could own the asset. It could be a 10-year, it could be a 20-year. And there's, of course, the fun stuff like tax credits that we can monetize and bring to the table that come through to the customer as well. So, we kind of bring everything together, right, to figure out the right solution from a finance standpoint. Of course, the technical side and the delivery model comes from Johnson Controls, and we come together there and provide that flexibility.
Nice. So before I get into Vic's sort of question about how well companies really understand these different mechanisms that are out there, let's do a little audience poll again. How many sustainability professionals are in the room? I figured I'd see a lot of hands go up, right? So you guys are the influencers, right? You've got to take some of the things we're talking about up here and transact them back into those that are going to be taking these decisions forward. Just curious, how many property managers are in the room? I got one brave soul in the back. Three brave souls. Okay. How many finance professionals in the room? I'm actually pleased to see hands going up on that one. So great. So audience, you got a little sense of the audience footprint here. So Vic, over to you. How well do companies and the decision makers within those companies really understand these kinds of options that are available to them?
Yeah, I think we can talk for hours, and because these are newer areas, like for example, ESCO. There is some knowledge, but it is not very much pervaded across the organization, especially with the decision makers. We were recently working with a large manufacturing organization, and Mark, you gave a beautiful example earlier about decision to invest capital and how those decisions sometimes get stuck. And they were in a similar situation where they knew that they need to make a massive change, and to make the massive change came with a decision where you need to actually have some capital investments as well. And that is when the clock starts to stop. Gears start to stop suddenly. That what do we do? So as we started to bring the visibility around the ESCO model, and actually Johnson Controls was one of the partners in this conversation on how can you create various financing models, but most importantly, how do you get that certainty that the results and the outcomes are going to be there? Because borrowing money can be an easier part. But living up to the commitments that come with that, because whoever is going to lend the money, they're going to have certain, expectations. That is, I feel, where the whole ecosystem comes together, and there isn't much knowledge in the ecosystem about how do those models work together. And I think, we will see in the next couple of years more and more prevalence of these options.
I think ESCOs have been around for a while. At least when I was at Carrier, they were still being sort of pursued. But I think you're right. I think the model is sort of adapting to this new challenge we're trying to deal with.
In the last couple of years.
And Michelle, maybe that's a good segue to the call it the lessons learned or other sort of factors that you're taking on at Microsoft when you bring these decisions into a decision-making kind of opportunity. Over to you.
Thank you. Microsoft has had an internal carbon fee since 2012. For those of you that were in the room, you heard Matt Hellman talk about that a little bit. But let's go back to the Wayback Machine in 2012. So how many of you in the room have set 2030 targets? You can raise your hand. How many of you have a perfectly allocated budget, agree with your CFO to hit all of those targets? Anybody? Yeah, all right. The rest of you, the therapy group starts at the bar at about 4 o'clock. You can come find me. It can't fund your work, but I can tell you a little bit about how we've started to bridge that gap between the two things at Microsoft. So we set that 2012 carbon negative or carbon neutral target and immediately implemented an internal carbon fee. We actually charge it. It's not a shadow price. We actually go into the P&L of all of the various units. We charge it across Scope 1, Scope 2, and business airline travel for Scope 3. Made us very popular around our data center business, as you can imagine. We started off with a relatively low price because the purpose for us in that carbon fee was to answer exactly that question that I posed to you, is how do you develop a stable budget that you don't have to go ask your CFO and rationalize for every single year? That's a really hard way to run your business. It's a really hard way to run durable reductions. So what we did, we said, you know what, it's not going to be 10. It's just going to be $20. $20 was about what we thought we needed for some investments in renewable energy and efficiency targets in 2012. We said $20 is basically what we think we need per unit of carbon to go through and come up with a stable budget that led us to our abatement. And we went in, we took it with the permission of our CFO, of course. They were a great partner in that, and essentially put it in an escrow fund. And then the sustainability team said, okay, based on where those emissions are most heavy, what is the right abatement cost? So very first thing we did was appropriate for this panel was our Smart Buildings Initiative. We had that on the docket for about 3 years. Once the carbon fee was introduced, that suddenly went from something that looked like a big OPEX to a cost savings because we introduced the negative side of that tax. Really changed the way that we looked at that. That project paid for itself twice, as we say in that business, because it meant that the real estate and facilities team's tax bill went way down, and our energy costs went way down. So sort of tax for a double win. For any of you in the US, you know that doesn't happen most of the time with taxes. But that was really sort of the entry curve for us into that. And then from each year, we saw more and more groups actually being very interested in getting into this because they found it as a way to get past that internal hurdle. It's sort of that VP level approval. I think some of you probably know what I'm talking about, where people like it, but then they have to go find $3 million for this. If you can find $3 million by avoiding a tax, suddenly the financial calculus for a lot of those things changes. And we did that up until 2020 when we set a carbon negative target, and suddenly $20 didn't look quite right. And we introduced Scope 3, even more friends across the business, as you can imagine. And we started to do 3 things in that. First, we started to better match the price to the cost of abatement. So business airline travel, no longer $20, it's $100 because we have a sustainable aviation fuel purchasing program, and it's a lot more than $20 right now to purchase SAF, as it turns out. As we look across some of the other parts of the business, we've also started a ramp into that. So if you've any gamers out there, you love Xbox, yes, thank you. You know, they think about what that looked like. So we're hitting our data center side of our business pretty hard with that tax. And we realized, you know, we all like to say it, sustainability needs to be part of everybody's business. Well, it also needs to hit all of their bottom lines, especially, and that's what that tax expansion did for us. So Xbox, in a scope 1 and 2 world, they're paying for compute power, right, to run cloud-based gaming. They're not doing much else. We introduced scope 3. Oh, that's all the raw materials that it takes to make consoles. It's the logistics to make consoles. It's the end of life to deal with all of those consoles and the energy consumption in that. And so Xbox's bill went from a rounding error for a very large billion-dollar business to a take me seriously sort of 3-digit in the million number, or 2-digit. I shouldn't blow that up too much. Their tax bill went way up. And so suddenly this $3 million project that we had sort of languishing to run telemetry against all of those Xboxes to get us out of the bad world of estimated avoided emissions to actual real-time data, same thing happened. That project got approved about 30 days after we rolled out the carbon tax for them in scope 3. And so there's really sort of this kind of beautiful symmetry that comes together when you're able to collect data, to charge money, to alleviate the tax bill. And I know that that doesn't seem like it's always a thing that makes sense. I would just tell you, we did this in 2012 for any of you starting right now. It's not, you know, the world's easiest task to convince your CFO at a growth company to take money out of your P&L. So, but there are pathways. And I think the most important thing is that it actually solved the biggest problem that I think we've been talking about on this panel, is that carbon and cash seem diametrically opposed, and the people that are really good in carbon language don't always talk about that in cash, and people that focus on this on cash see carbon as sort of a nice to have. And by putting those two things together, literally together, forced us to be in the same room with our CFO every single month, which has led to a whole new thing. So I think the tax was really useful, but the fluency in understanding the business value and the data to measure it, I think, is the most enduring success.
That is amazing. So make sure when you stay for the session we're going to do after this to really pick Michelle's brain on those experiences at Microsoft, because that's fascinating, that last point you made about bringing the finance community together with the carbon community inside the company to really help bridge the conversation around decision making when it comes to these investments. That's amazing. So thank you for sharing that. There's another dynamic overlay happening here, which is there's an increasing level of expectation for corporates to be accountable to their climate agenda. And this is manifesting itself sort of in Europe today, the emergence of regulatory language called CSRD, for those that aren't familiar with it. I'm sure most of you are if you're reporting into those regimes now. The SEC, maybe this April, I'm hearing, we'll see the first US climate regulation manifested in terms of mandatory disclosure. So an increasing level of accountability. And why is this important? It's not just for the companies, in fact, to be accountable to their reporting, but it's also for the financial markets to also pick up on these longer range, sort of longer view conditions, and start to make the investments that need to be made against those outcomes. So this is a really important moment we're getting into, which, sorry, it's a long-winded intro to Mark. These as-a-service programs that are starting to gain increasing popularity for investability are certainly playing into that, I think, that dynamic. Right. So perhaps some words from your experience on how you're seeing that sort of evolve.
Sure, and I think we said it a couple times here that the ESCO type model is not terribly new. It's been around for 30 years. It's been largely, though, a public sector discussion. And it was largely a public sector discussion because of the term of the arrangements. I mean, most of these are, getting well past what corporates would accept as, a short-term ROI. So with that change and with the pressure that everyone's feeling to hit their sustainability targets, you couple what Microsoft is doing, what we had to do internally, and putting an imputed cost of carbon, along with a way to make this more achievable over a longer term. That's where the as-a-service model starts to shine. And we're starting to see organizations that are accepting terms up into the 10-year, 15 years, even up to 20 years. And it's enabled by as a service and having the financing mechanism to go with it. But there's a really important element of making that as a service work. And I think you hit on this, is you need to have risk transfer and a way to manage the risk throughout the deal. And what's happening, and this is going to be attractive for the CFO discussion, is that when you couple somebody like a Johnson Controls or one of our peers in the industry that's willing to take on risk over the long term of performance, then lenders get more comfortable with better rates. And we're seeing improvements over what an organization would normally be able to borrow at themselves by having that risk transfer and the management of the long-term performance of the deal. So I might call on Reed a little bit just to talk about what are we seeing is improvement there, because it's remarkable, and CFOs love this story. So when you're having the conversation about, hey, here's what it's going to cost, there's also the piece of here's what it's going to save, not only in energy, operations, but now in financing charges. That makes this a much, much more attractive conversation.
Yeah, and I would put it as, if you look at traditional asset-backed, lending tied to an asset, tied to a cash flow, right? That's great. You have something to call on if you need to in a default situation, but you don't know the status of that asset when you take it, right? So as a lender or as a finance person, right, you know the status of the asset. When you start putting on the performance guarantees and the risk transfers with the technical operators that will be there for 20 years, physically, next to that asset, either remotely or physically there, right? You get a lot more comfortable, right, in the banking world, right, in the capital markets too. So we lean on that for sure, and our partners, right, definitely see the value of the risk transfer element of these deals. And again, those assets are only going to be worth more at the end of the term than they would have been otherwise without a performance guarantee wrap, a risk transfer element to it as well. So we're definitely seeing a lot of the marketplace accepting and wanting to deploy capital. Forget about the better rate or worse rate, right? They want to deploy the capital on these projects. So they're competing now, right? Which ultimately leads to a better financing position for the customer.
Fantastic. So, Vic, I think we talked at the beginning about we're woefully behind. There's a need for scale. There's a need for acceleration. There's a need for real impact. I haven't heard the statistic yet that built environment is roughly 40% of the world's carbon footprint. So it's a huge opportunity, but it's a huge challenge. Is this ESCO model, performance contract as a service, is this really gonna work to get us where we need to go?
I'm very optimistic. The reason being that in the last 6 months, we've had several financial institutions and PE firms reach out to us. And when you think of Accenture, you think of a technology company, the consulting company, and they're reaching out to us to partner with us because they want to deploy their capital for either EV charging infrastructure, for fleet electrification, for energy efficiency projects, because they feel that this is, all the factors we talked about. They feel that we have that partners in the ecosystem where we can, shift the risk, where can be guarantee of the outcomes that they're looking for, and short-term ROI, like not 30 years, but definitely more in the 10 years, sometime even 7 years. So definitely, I see a lot of uptake in the movement, and so I'm very optimistic because of that. But I think we still have to continue to educate the various stakeholders. Like you did a poll early on, we have sustainability professionals, we have property managers, we have finance leaders. I think it goes beyond. If you look at a manufacturing type of company, we got to get into the core of the manufacturing and engineering, because there are also decisions being made, and these individuals are actually very ROI focused. Once you share the model with them, the light bulb quickly goes on and they're like, why haven't I seen this model before? Let's start to work on that and let's accelerate. I think then we see the momentum. So I think the onus is also up to us to actually educate the broader set of stakeholders who can make these decisions faster. So I'm definitely optimistic.
There was no finish to that.
Let's end on optimism.
Let's end on optimism. I'm curious if we got any, Martin, any questions brewing out there? No? Any show of hands for a question that's brewing, perhaps, before we get into the home stretch? Okay, great. So let me try weaving something into this discussion that hopefully you'll all have a reaction to. Last September, we celebrated the 1-year anniversary of the Inflation Reduction Act. It was a huge investment made by the US government that I think provides a lot of leverage to decision-making that we're talking about here when it comes to finance. So on one hand, I'd love to hear your views as to how you're using the IRA to your advantage, I guess, within these project initiatives. And then on the other hand, are you concerned about those types of vehicles drying up or going away in the near or even midterm future? So maybe Reed, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely a game changer from our perspective too, and with the Transferability Act, right, that was implemented, that helps us really bring that value to our customers. So said differently, if we've got a $100 project, right, that's eligible via an ITC or PTC, 30%, we're able then to go monetize that in the market and then reflect that in our service payment to the customer, right? So it does fully, it reflects that element of the ITC and the tax credit. Now that's, under the ownership of the asset on our end. So sometimes the customers don't want to have us own the asset. They want to own the asset, but then they have the limitations on their own tax structure as well. And so you play that structure game right along the way, but you can fall on either side. But ultimately, that ITC and those areas are definitely very advantageous for the cash flow too. From trying to bring money to the table to the customer, and it definitely enhances it. On the back half question there, we are concerned about changes that could come forward, but I would say we hope that there would be a grandfather clause put in place that we've seen in the past collectively as well, and that would stay in place in terms of any projects that have been inked under the current guidance.
Yeah, one way or the other, we'll have a grandfather for president, I think. So, thanks. Michelle, maybe your thoughts, not on the last comment, but...
That's a different therapy hour. No, I think they're incredibly important. And we talked about sort of one side of the Microsoft lens. The other is that when we set up our carbon negative commitment, we also set up $1 billion investment fund ourselves. And I just think that there's, we've seen this work before, right? The infusion of cash in a nascent market really turning into a hockey stick, and that's what we've seen with renewables. And maybe it didn't happen on exactly the same time frame as that we expected on that initial rate of investment and return, but I think we'll see it here again too. And I think there are kind of two really exciting things that I think, harkening back to one of the other panels that the IRA has done for us. One is that it made efficiency sexy again. I think we should actually just embrace that. I think everybody realized that we actually have barely scratched the surface. We might have been talking about Industry 2.0 or 4.0 or whatever number we put against it. And there's a lot of talk without a lot of action. And I think the dollar component really changes that incentivization and that focus. I think the second thing that it's done is that it's also really started to find that kind of pair matching. I think we've done a much better job this time around, not just Microsoft, but industry in general, of really thinking about public-private partnership vehicles that give me a little bit more confidence that we're not entirely dependent on the whims of a government budget approval cycle to do that. And we see Microsoft do that. Like anybody in the tech industry, we put down $1 billion and just kind of waited to see whether it was Amazon or Google. It was going to be $2 billion. It was Amazon in their same investment fund. And so I think you start to see this competition for who can do the most good that is still tied back to that payoff. Our building campus work and our Scope 3 emissions numbers don't go down until we can actually start measuring the exact amount of carbon in the concrete, steel, aluminum server requirements that we put into every single data center we open, like 20 a year. That's a big amount of concrete. If we're having to use market-based emissions and we don't have access to green concrete that has data tied to it, that's a big OPEX cost that doesn't have any emissions return on investment that we can actually count. So I think that public-private partnership and that emphasis on data, it's like a requirement as a Microsoft person. I have faith in data, sorry. But it's that combination that I think we're actually seeing start to pay off.
Yeah, it literally changes the calculus, I think, right? And maybe Vic, and then I'll let you, Mark, have the final word. So Vic, your thoughts on IRA?
My unfinished pause from the previous question was exactly with that anticipation that, the money is available today. It's all speculation whether it's going to get grandfathered in or whether it's going to dry out. I would say the opportunity is now. It's available. Got to move fast to capture that. Definitely think, I would highly recommend that. I think outside that, I do feel that even if that money, just set that aside, I think my optimism, as you asked me earlier, is very robust because I feel that more and more financial institutions are stepping into this thing. So I feel that at the end of the day, if let's say the government money kind of dries up, actually corporation, PE firms, banks, they have realized that this is a good vehicle to drive good return on their investment. So they can definitely, find those customers. So I feel it's going to continue. So with that, We have helped a lot of clients with IRA and IIJ, both writing grants or actually helping with the execution of those projects. Sometimes we are writing the grants, so we can't be on the other side. Sometimes we don't help with the grants, so we can help them with the execution. I do hope that this money continues to be out there, because without that money and the financing available, we cannot accelerate the journey that you earlier talked about.
Mark.
I think Vic said this incredibly well. The money is here now. The time to act is now. We should go move on it everywhere that we possibly can. And I'll give you maybe two specific examples where we need to act. I mean, one is we're seeing a lot of geothermal show up in projects that has not shown up before. I think the solar piece is very obvious piece of the IRA. There was other pieces of it that were less obvious and more gray area, like thermal storage that had to be defined. And there were some projects that got put on hold because organizations were trying to figure out, did the government really have the right plan here, and were the regulations specific, and were we going to really qualify? That's been clarified, and now we can go roll with those. The second piece, though, is one that we didn't talk about a lot here, which is heat pumps. And at the end of the day, if you are in a building that uses simultaneous heating and cooling, which most do, or if you're in manufacturing and you have to electrify, heat pumps have to be part of that equation. And the IRA has spurred a massive investment in heat pump technology. We've been the beneficiary of that. The industry has been the beneficiary of that. And one of the things that we're going to see is applications of heat pump technology, both on cold extremes, cold outdoor extremes, as well as the ability for heat pumps to then generate the higher temperatures that they haven't been able to in the past. That is all direct result of IRA, and that is a direct impact on your electrification strategy, and something that we're super bullish about, right? No matter what happens with it going forward, that impact has already been felt.
So red state, blue state, doesn't matter. Write your congressman and tell them this is a vital piece of legislation that has to continue. And we're going to, just as WBCSD, we're looking to mobilize some language and activities around those types of messaging later this year. So certainly want to encourage participation in that. So climate finance is the great enabler for climate action. It fundamentally has to be in place. Reed, IonicBlue, you're doing what amazing things to help mobilize and get projects sort of transactable, I guess. So maybe final words for you, then Vic, Accenture, you're doing great work helping customers and clients understand how to unlock these types of mechanisms. Michelle, maybe final word from you. What can we learn that you've already experienced? And then Mark, I'm going to pass them one by one, and then Mark, over to you to kind of wrap things up. So Reed.
Before we do that, we do have a question, if that's okay.
It's perfectly okay.
The question is, how do we reconcile property owner incentives and building operator incentives to improve efficiency? For example, we know insulation improves HVAC efficiency, but the building owner usually has no incentive to invest in such addition. There's also a question about leaseholder improvements.
No, I mean, that is a classic question that we get, and it's definitely one that is challenging from a decision-making standpoint, but the structures exist to go make that happen. With the amount of time we have left, I am not going to bore you with all of those structures, but if you find one of us with the green, we're happy to have that conversation with you, because there are structures you can put in place that will outlast who the current property manager is, current tenant, and stay with the building. That's the key piece. And it's becoming easier and easier to overcome that challenge.
Nice. Final words.
Yeah, real quick. So I think we hit on it directly here, but again, we're here at IonicBlue to bring structures and flexibility around infrastructure and energy as a service, whatever that may look. The terms are there. The asset ownership we're agnostic to. right? We're here to monetize what's on the table, like we talked about between the IRA and other depreciation benefits. So, we are flexible purposely at this point in the journey because there's not one exact solution that works for all. And so we've seen the market pivot towards that. And I would just add back on too, it is changing that conversation from an ROI payback piece of equipment purchase with the CFO at your companies, at others as well. That has to be very much the first and foremost conversation, because you'll never unstick that unless you can tackle that early with the stakeholders that are making the decisions. So,
Vic?
I will say that I will do a call to action. Think about who are the 2 or 3 stakeholders. When I go back, I'm going to inform and educate about what I learned here about the financing and how can that play into my overall sustainability strategy.
Michelle?
I think the last bit, is really that stakeholder management and education piece that I would just leave people with, is that if you have never had a conversation with folks in your finance department, if you need to make your CFO and your CIO your best friends, because most of you in this room are already talking to your facilities folks because they provide data. Make sure that you've got assets in that office, and the biggest weapon that you bring to that party is data. I think outside of those ROI terms, you can start to translate that carbon water waste into the cost of doing business in the future. It certainly changed the way that we think about it. It's our CFO is now the first person at Microsoft that will tell you that when we say we're a sustainable business, it means that we are in business 50 years from now in a manner that makes us proud to be part of the world that we are. And when you get your CFO level that buy-in, it makes a lot of this a lot easier.
Great point. I had this question on a podcast that I did just a couple of weeks back. Somebody said, the interviewer said, what was your key takeaway from COP28? It was the first time I had the opportunity to go. It was amazing, amazing meeting. But my takeaway was this: we had so many people that were talking about what to go do. And we had very, very few people that were actually taking the action. And I'm with you, Vic. The action is a call to action. There are things that we can do now. There's technology that we can deploy now in energy efficiency. I talked about heat pumps. We talked about renewable energy. These things, there's no need to wait. We can deploy them now. They have great paybacks. We can make the CFO a great business case. And if we take that action now and get started, we're not going to feel the race to decarbonization that's going to happen at 2030. Because being in this industry and watching construction, watching the amount of data centers, watching the amount of electrification of buildings, there is definitely going to be a crunch where we hit a point where there's not enough talent, there's not enough contractors, there's not enough sustainability and energy professionals to go get the job done if we wait. If we take action now, we can go get this done. We can make a huge, huge impact.
Big round of applause. Reed, Vic, Mark, Michelle, thank you.